let's see. So it's great to be here. So this is a statement that I get without fail every single year. The flies are really bad this year. So everybody says this every single year. And so we're going to chat about why this might be, and we'll chat about how ticks are different. And so we're going to get a little bit of entomological knowledge today. And really, a little bit of entomology goes a long way. So if you can understand the insect biology and the ticks biology, it really helps you in making good decisions on how to control them. So we're going to talk about what influences pest populations. Why do they go up? Why do they go down? We're going to talk about insecticide resistance, why it develops. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you control ticks versus how you control flies. And then hopefully get you set up to making better pest management decisions for the future. So flies and ticks are very different. So they even have different numbers of legs. So if you count here, ticks have 8 legs in total, 4 pairs. All of our flies only have 6 legs. So they're completely different families. They're completely different. And so the way we manage them is also quite different. So I want you to look at the number of days to generation. So a fly in good climate, nice, warm, humid conditions like we have now, an egg can get laid and be an adult fly in 7 days. The colder it gets, the more that slows down. Ticks, on the other hand, depending on the species, can take 1 to 3 years to go from an egg to an adult. So to put this into perspective, the next field day that I've got to go to is next week. So if a fly is laying eggs now with the weather we have, they'll be adults by next field day. Worst case scenario, if it gets cold really suddenly, 24th of August, that's not that far away to have a whole new generation of flies. In contrast to ticks, if you have an egg laid today, a tick egg laid today, and you go out and buy a hamster, there's a strong chance that that hamster is going to die before the tick makes it to the adult stage. Right? So really, really different organisms. So because of this long lifespan that ticks have, the number of ticks that you have are determined not just by the weather conditions we have now, but the weather conditions we had 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Because each stage feeds on an animal once. It feeds on the animal, and then it falls off, and it stays in the environment. It molts into the next stage, and then it hangs out off until the next year. So if you have a larva feeding this year, it feeds and it falls off, and it molts into a nymph and only feeds again next year, molts into an adult, feeds again year 3. So there's a long time which it's in the environment. So it's in the leaf litter, just hanging out. So that's why we say your tick populations are affected by what the climate conditions were over time. So if you have a winter where you have a lot of snow, those ticks are hiding out underneath the snow. They're protected from the cold. If you have a winter that's dry and very cold, that's harsher for them. So we really are looking about the amount of time that they are spending off the host. And so they're also most vulnerable off the host. So when they're on the host, they're getting their nutrition, they're getting their water from the blood meal, but they're also kept warm from the animal itself. When you're off the host, you can dry out, you can get eaten by a chicken, you can get eaten by any number of things. And so they really spend most of their time vulnerable. So flies, on the other hand, their climate conditions, they're affected by climate conditions now. And so they can rapidly expand their population to make do with, you know, that saying, make hay while the sun shines. Flies really make hay while the sun shines. They really just crank out a lot of eggs and a lot of go through their cycle very quickly. The other thing is also, whereas ticks, every life stage has to feed on an animal, so it has the risk of not ever encountering a host. Flies, the larval stage and the pupal stage are spent off the animal, which means you really have to be managing your off-animal habitats to make any significant impact on the population. And so what we need to do is remove this breeding habitat, and I'm going to show you why. Fly populations get out of control really quickly. Have you ever noticed that the flies don't seem that bad, and then a week later there's just flies everywhere, and you're like, where did these flies come from? So this is one fly. So they lay their eggs, they like to lay their eggs together, and they can lay, 10 to 100 in a go. But if you have 10 flies laying all their eggs together, all of a sudden you have 1,000 little baby larvae hatching out of there. And so if 10% survive, and that's really low, there's no way only 10% survive, but even if only 10% survive through, if you've got one fly in a month, that's how many flies you've got. And nobody ever has one fly. So now put this on scale, right? If you saw 100 flies, each one of those 100 flies can do this. Things get out of control very, very, very quickly. And so what do? We go and we get our trusty pesticide and we say, there's too many flies, I'm going to spray them. So what we're doing is every time you use a pesticide, you're selectively breeding for flies that can tolerate that pesticide. So think about dogs for a moment. The common ancestor was this gray wolf, and yet somehow in a relatively short period of time, we've got Great Danes and we've got Chihuahuas. Two breeds that look very, very different because somebody decided that they wanted to have a really tall, leggy dog. And so they bred puppies that had long legs and bred them together, or I wanted a really small dog. So if you like a trait and you select for that trait carries through. It's the exact same thing that we're doing to the flies. So if you have a starting population of flies, never seen a pesticide, you decide that it's too much, so you spray. For the first while, it's really effective, right? You kill everybody. But what you're saying is, hey, flies, this is the product I'm using. I'm asking you to survive this because nature always wants to survive. So you're saying, instead of saying, I want a Chihuahua or I want a Great Dane looking dog, you're saying, because I'm giving you this pressure, I want flies that can survive this pressure. And so you spray year after year after year, and then a nice obliging fly says, well, okay, then, if this is my lifestyle, if this is what I'm going to encounter, by random chance, I get a mutation which allows me to survive. But we just keep spraying. We just keep spraying because it's always worked, and it's, too many flies, and we've got to keep going. What happens is, because you're not killing that fly that is now resistant, it becomes, over time, the predominant fly in the region. And now you have a problem. Because even though you could be introducing new flies, the bulk of your population is now resistant to this pesticide because you've exposed it to it too much. And the real big problem is, and producers always ask me, oh, do we have new chemicals coming? Are they developing something new? The problem is our flies are now getting to the point where if we develop a new chemical, there is a chance that it might work, but there's a strong chance that it won't. And unfortunately, we just got this proved recently. So there's a bunch of us who work on flies for our sins. We decided this was going to be a good career choice. And these are house flies now. And so we've got a network spanning the country, and we sent all our flies to this one person, and he's in California. And so I caught flies in Manhattan, and I just sent them there. And I was a little bit surprised. And so the idea behind the study was, we know that our flies in Kansas are resistant to a lot of pesticides that they commonly encounter. Does anybody give their dogs Bravecto for flea and tick control? Yeah, so it's a systemic, you feed it, it's a new chemical class, right? So we all got super excited. This is a new chemical class. Houseflies have never, ever, ever seen this chemical class. It has a completely different method of action. Reasonably, this should kill houseflies. It kills fleas, kills ticks, kills other flies. And look right up here at the top. I don't have a pointer, but you see there, KS. We had an 8% mortality in the females and a 19% mortality in the males. That means 8% of those females died. So 92% of the females were like, Yeah, sure, bring it on. A new compound they have never seen before. So even if Bayer or one of these other great pharmaceutical companies gets a new compound for us, it is highly unlikely that it is going to be effective, one, and stay effective is the second problem. So we have a real big problem. What they also did, they kindly tested us against pyrethroids. And so these are the genetic markers that predict if a fly is going to be resistant to pesticides. And so you see here, we're down in Kansas, we have this super KDR resistance, super meaning super bad. It's not just this population of flies, and this is not recent. I've got old publications that are 20, 30 years old that are saying that Kansas had the most pesticide-resistant flies of the ones they test across the nation. And it's catching up to us now. So we are quickly running out of things to do. So what's the solution? The first thing is know what kind of fly you have a problem with, right? Because that determines how you can control it. And the second thing is knowing where it breeds, because you have to stop that explosion. Going from the one fly to the hundreds of flies, you have to stop that. And the only way you can do that is removing its ability to reproduce. So we're going to talk about three flies here: housefly, stable fly, and horn fly. How many of you guys knew that there were three different flies? Okay, so good for you. How confident do you feel that you could look at an animal and know which ones it has? Okay, hopefully by the end of this, we have the solution to this. So we're going to start with the housefly. So houseflies, people just think of houseflies as nuisance, and they are a nuisance. We often see this in dairies and in feedlot situations. The problem is with these houseflies is they are absolutely riddled with bacteria. They pick them up everywhere, and they pick them up and then they fly to another area and then they clean themselves off and they deposit it there. So we're doing work that's actually looking at these bacteria in feedlots. And the really scary thing is that the bacteria that they're carrying contain drug-resistant elements, and not just one antibiotic, multiple antibiotics. And bacteria are very good at sharing things. So we haven't found necessarily alarming amounts in pathogenic bacteria for human health, but there's bacteria are sharing these elements all the time. Here, oh, I've got this resistant to this antibiotic, I'm going to give it to you now. And so we really worry about these houseflies because they are just absolutely riddled with these bacteria, and they can move off the premises. We often see them in the feed. They love feed, especially high protein and high sugar concentration. And their larvae, houseflies will develop anywhere. You can leave a little bit of food out that's decaying and they will make it a perfectly good home. What they really love is manure or decomposing feed. So areas around feed bunks where the feed is spilling over, that's a perfect breeding site. We scrape out pens, but how often do you scrape out the area around the water trough or underneath the fence? Every place I go to, if I just scratch around underneath a fence, I find maggots. So do yourself a favor, walk around and scratch around in the dirt. Anytime you see a maggot or a pupa, and I'll show you what a pupa looks like, you know you've got a place where it breeds and you need to remove it. We also see them on the faces and the noses of animals. What they really want is the facial secretions, because they're really high in protein and they need that to make their eggs. So stable flies, we always underestimate the number of stable flies we have. So you'll often find these on the legs of the animal, especially the lower legs, sometimes on the belly. But if you go out and you see, oh, she's okay, she only has 5 flies on the legs. That's fine. So then you go away and then you come back in the afternoon. Oh, she's still only got 5 flies. Everything's fine. Those are 5 different flies. So these flies will only feed between 2 and 5 minutes. So each time you're seeing a fly, it's actually a new fly. So those numbers add up. In most of our blood feeding insects and our ticks, they have anesthetic compounds in their saliva because you don't want the animal to know that you're feeding, right? If you can stay hidden from your host, you get a really tasty meal. We can't find any anesthetic in the saliva of stable flies. And anybody who's been bitten by a stable fly realizes how painful it is. So they have really, really painful bites. They cause a lot of stress. They're not really big transmitters of pathogens, but the amount of pain that they cause is really a problem, and we call it fly worry, and I've got a video to show you guys. So these stable flies will, anywhere where you have plant material that is decomposing, stable flies love it. How many of you guys feed hay bales over the winter? Almost everyone, right? You know how they poop and pee around their hay bale and then they dig it into the ground? If you put a net over that hay bale and you just leave it, millions of flies will come out of that. And scientists have done that, and like hundreds of thousands of flies came out. So your hay bales, anywhere where there is decaying plant material, is the prime breeding site for a stable fly. And we normally see these earlier on in the spring when it's nice and humid. They tend to dip off when it gets drier in the summer, but if we have a wet fall, they can always come back. So how do I know if I have stable flies? So you see the stable flies here on the leg, and the head is always pointing upwards. So we don't know why they do this, but a stable fly will always orient with its head pointing upwards. So if you've got a biggish fly on a leg or on the belly and the head is up, that's most likely a stable fly. So look at do you see how they're stamping their front legs? Super agitated, and everybody's stamping their front legs. If you see animals stamping legs like that and kicking at their belly, that's stable flies. So everybody's pretty agitated and stamping. And that's because those bites are painful and they're trying to dislodge the flies. So stamping of legs, very good indication that you have a problem with stable flies. You'll often see this with stable flies too. So if they can't get away from the flies and the stamping isn't working, they'll just go hang out in the pond. And what are they not doing if they're standing in a pond for hours on end? They're not eating. A large amount of stress is caused by just the sheer annoyance of being bitten all the time. And so when stress hormones go up, everything else starts to fall apart, right? You get sick when you're stressed. So constant pressure from insects, that constant stress of being bitten and the pain of it and trying to escape it. Not only are you not eating, but it shifts the way your immune response behaves. And it makes you more susceptible to other things that are floating around. Horn flies, this is our biggest problem. So these little guys, each fly bites 20 to 30 times a day. And those bites are painful. You'll see those animals swishing tails and throwing their head back, and they are getting really, really, really annoyed and hurt by this constant feeding of the fly. Now, the good thing is if you can remove them off the animal, and you've got way back when, before pesticides were a thing, you put them through a walk-through trap, and the flies will die pretty quickly once they're off the host. They can last 2 or 3 hours. But they stay on that animal 24/7. And next time you go out and you have flies, and this for me is the most fascinating thing, you have some animals that have high numbers of flies and some animals that have low numbers of flies. When she flicks her head back and the flies lift up, they settle back down on the same animal. They pick an animal and they stay on that animal for the rest of their life. And so like our stable flies, they had heads pointing up. Horn flies will always have their heads pointing down. And over here, we have the real problems that they have. We have reduced weight gains. We have reduced forage efficiency. We have increased incidences of salmon mastitis. And the big thing is stress. Aside from taking away blood, there is a possibility if you take enough blood away from an animal, it dies. We don't normally see this with parasites, but that blood has to be replaced. Every time a fly bites an animal, that animal has to expend energy to replace that blood. And that's energy that's not going to other things. So it really is a problem. And then also the stress. So you'll often see horn flies and stable flies commingling. So at the bottom in green, we have a stable fly, and you can see the heads pointing up. And then at the top, you've got the horn fly and the heads pointing down. And a stable fly is about twice the size of a horn fly. So whereas our house flies and our stable flies needed decomposing plant material, horn flies will only breed in fresh cow manure. Unless you have pasture-grazed animals close to feedlot animals, you will not see this in a feedlot situation because the manure gets trampled into the mud. They need to have an intact cow pat. And so it makes it harder to control. You know, you can clean out a pen, you can clean out hay bales, you can do all these things, but when it's in the manure itself, it's much, much harder to control. But we'll give you some things that you can do. Okay, so what you really need to do is, now that you know who you have a problem with, and chances are you have a problem with more than one insect, you have to develop a way to get rid of them. And so because of our big problem with pesticide resistance, what we're trying to do is do as many things as we can that don't use pesticides, and then using pesticides as a last resort. We won't get away from using them. We will still need to use them, but if we can use them properly, we can delay this inevitable development of resistance for as long as possible. So we've almost, for about 50 years, we've been doing this the wrong way around. So we've been using pesticides and just spraying everything and killing everything, and everything's been good. But it's really interesting because I've got old extension reports where this was before conventional pesticides were available. And this poor extension agent was going out trying to convince people to use these pesticides because they really work well. And none of the producers were wanting to use it because they wanted to do what they've always been doing, right? And they were doing this kind of thing. Now I have the opposite problem, because now I'm having to try and convince people to stop using pesticides and do what we did way back when, and nobody wants to give up their pesticides. So the producer hasn't changed in 100 years. You guys are still making life difficult for us. So what we really need to be doing is removing those breeding habitats. If you remove the places it breeds, you will significantly reduce your pest population. And then we're going to go up and look at some examples of how this is. So good sanitation and habitat changes, just keeping things clean. Like nobody wants, you know, when you're a kid and your mom was like, oh, go clean your room. Any of you who have teenagers, clean your room. Nobody wants to clean their room. This is really a clean your room kind of a situation. If you just go out and look for maggots and pupa, those are breeding sites that need to be gotten rid of. And then you stop that explosion from having one fly to hundreds of flies. And so that's what I do. I just go out with a little spade and you dig around. These are the pupa. Anytime you see something like this, this is a problem. Anytime you see something like, you see these little, they look like almost grains of rice, but kind of squashed at the top. And they'll be, when they're really fresh, they're more of a reddish color, and then they get darker, more blackish as they get older. If you see those, that's your indication that there's a problem. If you see those and you don't clean it up, you can't be mad when the flies become a problem, because they're telling you where they are. They're making it really easy for us. All you need to do is just go around and dig in some dirt. Special attention anywhere where things are accumulating. So often underneath railings, you know, I call them the manure lava flow on the outside of a pen as manure gets pushed out and kind of flows over the edge. Those are prime areas where it's not getting disturbed because the animals aren't treading on it, but it's got what they need. It's got those nutrients. So ticks and hornflies, cultural control is a little bit harder because it's a pasture type situation. We've done research this year to look at the impact of burning, and burning significantly reduces your tick population. The key is, though, that you have to burn properly. So we had pastures that were burnt either in the fall or the spring or the summer for 4 years. And then we have an unburned pasture. And so I sent my students out and we had picked 3 sites within this unburned pasture. 2 came back with tons of ticks and 1 came back with no ticks. And now, as a good scientist, you're not supposed to drop things that aren't convenient, right? I would like it if all 3 of those had lots of ticks, because that makes a nice story. But I have this one weird one where I can't find any ticks. We came back a week later. We didn't know that that was part of the burnt section. This was separated from me to you. So a road between burnt and unburnt. Once ticks fall off an animal, that's where they stay. So they don't move around. So the difference between lots of ticks and no ticks is not very big. So if you have trees or pockets or anywhere where that grass and that protective layer, they hide out in that leaf litter, if that's not getting burnt off, that's a pocket. That's the difference between a road, no ticks there and lots of ticks there. And animals will go into those shady areas to get away from everything else. And that's also where the ticks are protected. So just be careful that your under tree areas are getting burnt properly and as much as possible. So far, what the data suggests is that burning in the spring is the best time for controlling your tick populations. We also found more dung beetles in the pastures that we burnt in the spring. And so we didn't find any difference in the species, they just seem to be more of them. And it's probably because these guys need to roll their little balls, and burning earlier in the year, it's easier for them to roll their balls, so they're more successful as parents. They also form mated pairs. So they have a little husband and wife team that are rolling their ball together, which is just delightful. So remember I said the hornflies are breeding in that fresh manure, right? So there's two things that you can do. They've shown that in patch burning, you can reduce your hornfly populations by half by burning, right? It looks like this is most impactful in the spring or the fall. Bearing in mind that the beetles are most happy if you burn in the spring, what they're doing is they're burying that manure. So they're taking away that breeding site for you. You don't have to do anything. They'll do it for you. And so what they do is they take the manure, they bury it underground. That means that the hornfly larvae can't develop anymore. They might develop, but what they're going to do, they're buried underground. The other really important thing is gastrointestinal nematodes. So they hatch out of their eggs and crawl up the blade of grass, and then the cow comes along and eats the grass, and then she's got more nematodes. If that manure is buried underground, there's no more nematodes. So dung beetles are one of our best friends. And unfortunately, one of the things that we do is deworm with ivermectins, and that will just decimate dung beetle populations. And so when you're looking at a pest management thing, you have to look at not who do I have, what pest problems do I have, but also what are the things that I'm doing that could be negatively impacting their ability for our beneficials to get rid of things like manure for you. The other thing that you can do is feed through insect growth regulators. There was, for a long time, it's been flying around, you know, that if you use those growth regulators, they can't get resistance. They for sure can get resistance. I know this because I saw them. So I had these deformed pupa that were in the lab, and I was so excited. I'm going to take pictures of this to show my students. This is what happens when you feed a growth regulator. Your pupa, instead of being nice and rounded, they're all deformed and they look wonky. Well, out of those wonky pupa, flies emerged. So even if you're feeding insect growth regulators, we will have a problem with the resistance coming soon. Okay, so screens and traps. This is harder to do with flies. You know, this is only really in a dairy type situation if you can screen it off and things like that. If anybody wants to, there's plans on the internet for a walk-through trap. If you can get animals to walk through that every day, you can significantly reduce your hornfly populations without doing anything else. But the trick is that they've got to walk through it. Biological. So these are little predator wasps. These guys are tiny, tiny, tiny little things. They're remarkably tiny. But their whole job in life is to find housefly and stablefly pupa, lay their eggs in it, and then those little baby wasp larvae just eat up all the pupa. I've got dairies and feedlots who only use those flies. They don't use the parasitoid wasps. They don't use anything else. And it works. But you have to do it properly. You have to keep releasing them, and you can't use anything else. As much as our flies are resistant to everything, these poor little guys are susceptible to anything. So you can't have wasps and spray pesticides. But if you get it set up well, it can be really, really beneficial. And so then what you do is after this, so you do all these great things and you try and knock the population back as much as possible. If your population is still too high, then you start moving to chemical control. So start off with things like repellents, insect growth regulators. So people sometimes misunderstand the role of like a essential oil type. You see them now, they're normally in the green spray bottles. We're moving more towards these plant extracts to control flies. They're not as effective at killing them, but what they do is they really repel the flies away from the animals. So it's not stopping them from feeding completely, but it's inhibiting their feeding. So the amount of eggs a fly will lay is directly proportional to how much blood she took up. So if you can make feeding difficult for her by making it not as nice, and maybe I'm a little bit confused and maybe I'll go off somewhere else, you can actually have quite an impact on your fly population. And then the last thing is using the conventional pesticides that we've been using, but make sure that you use them properly. You don't want to be breeding resistant flies. So every time you use a chemical, I want you to think about the Chihuahuas and the Great Danes. Am I making a Chihuahua or a Great Dane out of these flies? So always follow the label. If it says dilute 1 to 5, dilute 1 to 5. Don't think, oh, well, this is really expensive, and now I have to buy 2 bottles just for those extra 2 head. I bet you I can take my 1 bottle and just make it stretch a little bit. This is not a place where you ever want to make anything stretch. Back in the olden days, when kings and queens were worried about being poisoned, they would take small amounts of poison to develop a tolerance to it. If you are diluting things out too much, that's what you're doing. You're saying, here, fly, here's a little bit of the poison, not enough to kill you, but enough to really make sure that I'm giving you the best opportunity to develop that resistance. So get good weights on animals and making sure that you apply enough product. It's a pain to do this, but it really, really does help. If you don't get accurate weights, you're underdosing animals. And again, you're giving it its exposure to a sublethal dose. And then we're somehow surprised when flies are like, oh yeah, no, this is cool. I live here. Thinking about where you're applying the product is really, really important. So remember, I told you the horn flies spend their whole lives on the animal. So if you're using a pour-on, those horn flies are coming into contact with it all the time. So lots of contact time, a lot of exposure time. The stable flies, 2 to 5 minutes. So if you're spraying a pesticide on the legs of your cattle to get rid of the stable flies, they're not coming into contact with it for long enough for it to do any harm. But it is giving it exposure to it to develop resistance. A lot of the products that we use on animals are also products we use on crops. So if you have crops and you're spraying crops, your stable flies are developing in those, the plant material when you're harvesting and it's decomposing. If you've sprayed that, another area where you're maybe inadvertently are getting resistance. Use a good annual rotation. So it used to be that they said use 2 years of pyrethroids and 1 year of organophosphate. We now have such problems with resistance to both of these that we're now saying that, okay, the best thing to do is use a pyrethroid in year 1, year 2, use an organophosphate, and year 3, use a macrocyclic lactone. Do not pair things together. So if you want to do a pour-on and an ear tag, by all means do it. But don't use a pyrethroid pour-on and an organophosphate ear tag. Stay within the same chemical class for a year and then swap out. Because when you're mixing classes, you're giving them exposure to 2 things at once. And that just spreads how quickly this resistance will develop. And think about other areas that you are using pesticides. Remember that flies especially will move, your stable flies and your house flies. So if you're putting, there's a lot of flies in the office, so you're going to spray them around the office. If house flies are coming into contact with that, they're taking that exposure with them when they go. Stable flies too. I believe there was a question about the sulfur before I arrived, and Jamilyn said that the question about whether sulfur will be impactful. And sulfur is actually one of the first, it's like way back when, it's in like Mesopotamian scripts and all sorts of like really old stuff. They used crushed sulfur to control flies and mites. So sulfur is toxic to them, so it will definitely help. We've got to get away from thinking that there's a magic silver bullet, like I only need to do this one thing and it's going to control my ectoparasites. What we really need to be doing is kind of hitting it everywhere where we can.